Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar news update video. So in this one I want to talk primarily about this interesting San Diego Comic-Con interview that Mike and Bryan did with IGN. So this video has just gone up within the last hour or so. It's a 7.5 minute video. I'll have it linked below if you want to check it out. It's actually interesting just because it's Mike and Bryan being open in an interview for the first time in a while. They're obviously a little bit more open during the panel where they announced the Seven Havens image and stuff like that, but here they actually get asked some decent questions here. It's actually a pretty good interview, and so it's interesting to kind of feel like we're in the mode of oh, they're back talking about this stuff, they're accepting questions to a certain degree. So there is some interesting stuff here. You can see the headline on the video is Avatar: The Last Airbender creators confirm Steven Yeun's role in the new movie. Now, if you've been following the channel, you probably know what this means. We'll get into it. But I have some notes here and we'll go kind of through it here. So right at the start, they introduced the series. The interviewer mentions, the Aang movie coming out October 2026, and then the show Seven Havens the year afterwards. So they kind of give us a kind of partial confirmation of 2027 for Seven Havens, which again we knew from Toy World magazine. And for anyone doubting that, the part of the article where that was mentioned was kind of highlighted. They specifically had a source from Paramount there, so it was kind of confirmed, and because it's attached to merchandise, it actually has a decent amount of validity to it. Not to mention, it's a very obvious thing. If the movie is the first project and it's out in October 2026, of course the second project will be after that, but not too far away, because the entire point of Avatar Studios is that they're working on multiple projects at the same time, and they won't have a ginormous gap between projects. So 2027, we don't know when in 2027. Is it going to be early 2027, or are we talking about the full year between projects where it will be more like October 2027? We don't know. Then they get to the obvious question of she just asked the obvious one, which is Steven Yeun is attached to this movie. We don't know who he's playing. Can you tell us? Mike and Bryan kind of look at each other and it's should we? And then they kind of settle, I guess, on the idea that, well, all the other main cast members, so it's pretty obvious who the voice actor who doesn't have a character is. And yeah, they just confirm. Steven Yeun is our voice for adult Zuko in The Legend of Aang: The Last Airbender. So yes, finally, absolute confirmation. We've known it for a while now, but Dante Bosco has never been attached to this movie officially. There's lots of rumors and people jumping to conclusions that was confirmed, but it was never confirmed. Especially over, I suppose, the last year, where we had the idea that Steven Yeun is attached to the movie, but not Dante Bosco. I think it's been pretty obvious that this was the direction that they were going to go in. So this makes a lot of sense. It joins the rest of the voice actors in terms of, they've now completely changed the casting for all of the kind of main Team Avatar members here, which I think is probably the right thing to do. I think it would have been a little bit weird if they just kept one of them but then changed all the other ones, whereas in this case it's just hey, it's the older versions of the characters for a full movie. We are going to do completely different casting to emphasize their characters as adults. I think that's perfectly fine. Interestingly, when they mention this, they talk about the idea Steven Yeun obviously has been on Avatar before. He voices Avatar 1 from Legend of Korra, the first Avatar. And when this gets brought up, the interviewer is kind of can you say anything about that? Is he coming back to voice Wan? And Bryan, I think, is a little bit taken aback by the fact that he's been directly asked this question, is Avatar 1 going to be in the movie? And Mike is the one to come in and sort of answer the question, saying we're not talking about that right now. We can't talk about that right now. So they get the sort of no comment, non-answer type thing here, in that I guess it's one of those things where they don't want to just be we can confirm Juan is not in the movie. That would be a weird detail to kind of put out there. But they also don't want to theoretically confirm he is in it if that is the case, because that would ultimately spoil a probably super hype moment if that was the case. Obviously, Avatar 1 appearing in the movie does make sense to a certain degree if they're going to do a big, crazy Aang Avatar state thing. Him connecting all the way back to the start of the cycle is a way to kind of do that in a cool way. there's almost, to a certain degree, there's maybe speculation because the movie theoretically was called Lost Realm at a certain point. It speaks to the idea of like history, ancient history, and maybe Aang might need to ask a very old Avatar some questions, maybe going all the way back to the first one. So there was a possibility of this, and this is why like people have talked about Avatar 1 for a while, because like, hey, that's a notable thing, referencing the first Avatar again. It's not a crazy concept, but we got no answer either way on it. So it keeps it open, but like I'm not sure if it confirms in any way that it's happening. While they were talking about, what did they move on to next? Yeah, they actually talked about the comics, interestingly, next, as like, read the comics as a way to read some of the transition material between the end of Avatar and where this movie is going to take place. And they highlighted like the initial run on the comics, like the Promise, the Search, the Rift and stuff like that. And then they went into like Imbalance, more kind of shows early Proto-Republic City. And they mentioned that Cranefish Town, they mentioned that Republic City is a big location in the movie. Now, I think this was always going to be the case. This was like an important like continuity point that they were never not going to do in the movie. It would be weird if we didn't see Republic City in the movie. But I think just the fact that they're maybe calling it that is interesting in terms of like, okay, so I guess in the, 8 to 10 years between like Imbalance and where this movie theoretically takes place, it does go from being Cranefish Town to Republic City if they're confirming that it's called Republic City in the new movie. So that's interesting. Does it confirm that like the whole movie is set here? I don't think so, but obviously I'm guessing the intro to a certain degree of the movie is going to be here. Like the characters are going to find out about other stuff from Republic City and then maybe move to whatever the actual kind of main plot is. We don't know what that really is overall. So yeah, there's that. Then they talk about Seven Havens, and this is where most of the discussion about this effectively revolves around the idea of like, here's why it's so different. Here's why this is not the almost expected follow-up show to Korra or something like that. And if you've listened to a lot of Bryan interviews, you've probably heard him say something along the lines of this before, because this was always what they said in terms of, here's why the second Avatar animated show was Korra and not like a sequel Aang show, is because they wanted to do something very, very different and unique with the series, with the projects. He talked about the idea that like animated shows are kind of like hard to do. It's like a privilege in a way that they even get to do more as part of Avatar Studios. So to a certain degree, they're not going to waste something that they put so much time and effort into by just doing the standard formula over and over again. They want each one to be unique and kind of different. They want the world to evolve. It's kind of pretty much a direct quote to what they said. And that's what makes them interested kind of creatively in, thinking about series to do and stuff like that. So that's a big thing, and they've been super consistent. This should not be a surprise with our creators to you, that this is the way they approach things, is that they like the big projects to be quite unique and different. This is effectively, I suppose, also part of the reason why like they're not doing like adaptations of anything, why like they're not doing adaptations of comics or novels, is because in their minds those stories are out there in those mediums. Why would they use one of these animated projects to do something that already exists when they could do something new and unique and interesting to them? That's a really important detail to keep in mind with Bryan and sort of like choice of story type thing. Mike emphasized really heavily the mystery aspect of Seven Havens. And I think this is super important. I latched onto this like immediately from the description, from the leaks. Everything about this show definitely to me leans in the mystery aspect. You go in, you look at everything. Everything is like, why is that the case? Why did that happen? What happened in the past? What did Korra do or didn't do? What happened to Pavi's leg? All these things. Where did she meet her animal companion? Who is Jay? What happened to the world, of course? What is the deal with the Seven Havens and the cities? Why are they like that? What's unique about them? They're really emphasizing that. And I think I have confidence as well because of, in a way, how confident the announcement sort of was, that like, we already know it's 2 seasons, 13 episodes in each season, 26 overall. They know what they're doing. And in a mystery show, kind of think it's good that you know straight away from the start how many episodes there are going to be, so they know how many episodes they have to get the mysteries, the answer to those mysteries out there. So that's quite exciting. They, just for anyone maybe wondering, they once again emphasize, and they've said this basically in the past on interviews, that like they're not the day-to-day showrunners on Seven Havens. Other people are filling those kind of main positions on the show. They're still involved, of course, because they're in such high positions at Avatar Studios overall, but they're overseeing all the different projects, which means that they're maybe not as hyper involved in every single one individually. They are relying on key people in key positions, like say Lauren Montgomery as the director of the movie, to do that, and some of our key people involved in Seven Havens to do that. But we do know that, like, I think Bryan is maybe a little bit more involved in like the art direction of maybe one of the upcoming things, not the Aang movie or Seven Havens, but one of the series afterwards he might be a bit more involved in, which is interesting. Then, in a kind of fascinating kind of moment, of course it's IGN, so they ask about the big Avatar RPG video game. Now, for context on this, and I feel I need to give context on this because I do think some people have forgotten about this, some people haven't, but some people have. What they're talking about here is this. This was announced late-ish last year. They announced that, yeah, they are doing a big Avatar RPG game. Basically the game everyone wanted Avatar to have to be for years. They're finally getting to do it. They had an initial thing up on the video saying it was called Avatar Ice Wars. I get the impression that that is very much a placeholder title rather than a locked-in title, because when they officially revealed the art that's kind of up there now, they took out the, titling in terms of what's actually going on. But you can see it kind of gives you a little bit of context for what we're about to talk about here, in terms of it is set in the past, 7,000 years in the past. It is about the water tribes, kind of primarily to a certain degree, with the Ice Wars title. That would make sense. And the premise is a volcano explodes and sets forth the world on like an ice age, basically. That sort of idea. And there's a bunch of quotes from that video game podcast interview from a while back where there's a little bit more information on it. But I think a really important detail is super heavy estimate. And again, this was last year. So like almost an entire year has passed since this. And they were saying 2027 at like the absolute earliest, 2028 more likely. But even then, maybe beyond this. So this might be like a 2029 thing. So we're not really close to it. And I think what they said in the interview gave that impression that like they obviously, I get the impression, haven't seen much of what's actually happening maybe in direct development. They've been involved in, helping to develop the story, construct the core ideas, but I don't get the impression the game is like super far along to where they could say anything super concrete. So yeah, they focus on the story stuff that we basically already knew about before, and there's like no mention of like gameplay mechanics or footage that they've seen or anything like that. So yeah, I very much get the impression we are not seeing anything about the Avatar video game anytime soon. They did mention the idea of it being set 7,000 years in the past was sort of something that seemed to come from working on the Aang movie, and then older ideas that they had, thinking about Water Tribe history, made them come up with this idea of that should be the video game story. So that's kind of cool. Bryan, when he was mentioning this, did say it's either 7,000 or 8,000 years. Now, they were a little bit more concrete, saying 7,000 years in the previous interview, so I'm assuming it is 7,000 years, but maybe there's a chance they change it to 8. This part of the timeline, like, it could be either or. It theoretically doesn't matter too much. Either way, it is pre-Four Nations. They actually mentioned that here in the interview, which I thought was quite interesting, whereas otherwise there was a little bit of figuring out to be done when they mentioned this kind of in the first place. But yeah, pretty much anything that's like 4,000-ish years before Aang is considered to be pre-Four Nations existing. And that's what Bryan says in the interview, is the idea that when you watch Avatar The Last Airbender, you assume the Four Nations have just been a thing that have existed forever. But then you realize that, like, in Wan's time, there were no nations as such. You could maybe make the point that because of the elemental theming of each line turtle, it was sort of like that. But they clearly weren't like that Line Turtle City that Wan was on was not clearly Fire Nation as such, that sort of idea. But that even after the Line Turtles go away, it still takes thousands of years for all those groups of people to eventually form into the four nations that we know them to be in Aang's era, and the, I guess, eras immediately before that as well. So that's a super interesting detail, they mentioned that clearly. And then they ended with the idea that, like, basically, okay, you've got your movie coming out, you've got your show coming out, what else is Avatar Studios working on? And they just said very vaguely, other series, other games, other features, as in, I took that to be like other animated projects at Avatar Studios, and that's where the interview ended. So pretty cool stuff. I just like this, that it was them being willing to answer the questions. I like that they kind of did an interview where, like, they had someone asking questions where they felt like they were pretty informed about, like everything going on with Avatar. Like, okay, it's IGN, you expect them to mention the video game, but, like, not a lot of people know that the exact details of that, to mention some of the stuff about that. And even just to say, like, for instance, in this early section, like, just the mention of, like, hey, asking the question about, like, is Avatar 1 back, was a bit of an interesting thing for me. But moving on to a little bit of other information. So about Awakening of Roku. Of course, this was announced just before Comic-Con, at Comic-Con. Randy Rabai posted on Instagram here, basically just giving us a more, like, official mention of the description. It's mostly accurate to what came out of the panel, but there's a little bit of extra detail. So the significant part is this: set 3 years after the previous book, Avatar Roku, Gyatso, and a new friend race to stop a mysterious illness from destroying the Northern Water Tribe's way of life. So we knew about all this, except the a new friend part. We didn't hear that coming out of the panel. So that's the main new detail that we're kind of looking out for. So that's interesting. I guess for this mission, they will have a member of Team Avatar here, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, it's going to be set in the Northern Water Tribe, some sort of a mysterious illness. Set 3 years afterwards means obviously it's going to be Roku at about 19 or 20. Depending on, I suppose, how they factor in the timing from the first book and how much time passed. Like, they could say that this is like 3 and a bit years later, so he's actually the full 20. But I'm assuming the idea here is mostly going to be about him probably finishing up his airbending training, and this is him moving on to the next stage of his Avatar training, which is to go to the Northern Water Tribe to train waterbending, which we know from the show he does with his master, Taukukak. Now, the details surrounding that, I think, highlight that he is probably not the friend mentioned in the description here, because part of that backstory is that Taukukak only agrees to train Roku after Roku has kind of been in the Northern Water Tribe for a while and kind of embraced the culture, lived there for a little bit, and kind of learns to respect him. Whereas it doesn't really feel like that's necessarily the idea here, where, like, they're going to meet Taukukak and he's going to go on a mission with them, but he still will refuse to train Roku by the end of the book. There's maybe a way to make it work, but I get the impression it's probably not him. So it should be another character. I assume, just if they're going to be exploring Northern Water Tribe stuff, that it probably has to be a character from the Northern Water Tribe, just to give you that kind of context, but don't really know what exactly to make of that. It does mean, in terms of some speculation about this book, we can kind of focus in a little bit on, for instance, some of the Water Tribe information that we have from the RPG about the Water Tribe in the Roku era. So, you know, for instance, from this, now, keep in mind, the RPG is set at the end of Roku's training, so it's a bit later on, but I'm assuming the leaders are all going to be roughly the same. So Quanit is our southern chieftain of the era. Skiri is the Northern Water Tribe chief, and this is kind of significant because he should be the acting leader when Roku shows up here, which we would expect, of course, that, like, if the Avatar is visiting, they're going to have a meeting with the leader overall. So some interesting stuff here. There's not actually too much information about Skiri overall, but some interesting kind of core ideas to kind of play off. And then if he is a significant character of any sort in the book, that is a place to potentially go into some details on. Maki Tuk is kind of interesting because this character is a spirit bender. And if the illness stuff requires spiritual aid, of course, Roku is there to do stuff. But this character obviously has a lot more kind of spirituality kind of going on, being a spirit bender pre-Unalaq and stuff like that. So, interesting one. Teak, who we're going to get more on from the Voyage of the Unity stuff, but is also a kind of sort of significant kind of Water Tribe character. From the south, though, I'd be kind of surprised if this character shows up, especially because Teak is specifically sort of focused on the Unity, which is a thing that sets sail at the time that this is happening rather than something in the past, so likely not. There's Talkukok, of course. Here's the detail I was mentioning before. He initially refused to train Roku, believing that any Fire Nation subject would hold a higher loyalty to the Fire Nation than the people of the Four Nations. However, Roku refused to seek another instructor and eventually convinced Talkukok of his own devotion by living in the north for several years. That definitely gives the impression that, like, it should be a bit after this where that happens. Unless, in the meantime, he has met Talkukok before to maybe try and preemptively start his waterbending training, I don't get the impression that that's necessarily kind of what exactly we are doing. The only other stuff I'll bring up is from the first book. They are emphasizing still that there is a little bit of a block, theoretically, with Roku and waterbending because of what happened to his brother. So that might still be a thing that needs to be kind of addressed in terms of, like, I assume he'll potentially have his first breakthrough at waterbending maybe in this book, so they're going to try to emphasize that to, like, a certain degree. So that kind of will be interesting, because it is a little bit unclear, like, in terms of, like, how super connected to the first book is this going to be, in terms of, like, references, because is, like, Sozin going to be involved here? Any of the plot threads we set up there, like with Tom In and Omashu and stuff like that, is that coming into play? Or are we just kind of, what we're doing with this book is just, hey, here's Roku a little bit later, another mission. That's kind of the point of the book, rather than anything else kind of super thematically. But like I said, there's a few open plot threads for the first book that, like, from a character point of view, they definitely would want to cover and highlight. So I'm definitely intrigued by this one. And almost the idea that, like, they are jumping ahead so much is a positive for me. That, like, the books don't just have to be this one incident that all takes place over the course of, like, a couple of months, just told across 2 books. The fact that it's a 3-year time jump is actually, like, good in my mind, showing a little bit of variety within the series, that it doesn't all have to be the exact same format. So yeah, that's that. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the Mike and Bryan interview with IGN and some of the details here. So I suppose primarily it is Steven Yeun confirmed for Zuko. I have pretty much confidence that, like, Steven Yeun's going to do a very good job as adult Zuko. So I'm perfectly fine in that regard, given that, like, I'm not someone who overly focuses too much on the voice actors overall. I think he's a good choice, and that will be fine. But anything else that was mentioned in the interview, do you find interesting? Just even the fact that Mike and Bryan are doing an interview, this somewhat still early in the process. And then also anything about Awakening of Roku, now that we have maybe a little bit more detail to kind of dive into on. But otherwise, yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.